Welcome to Santa's desk. Every conflict has two stories, the one told in press conferences, and the one you only see when you step back and look at the map. Today, we're looking at how the narrative of the U.S.-Iran war changed in just 7 days. At the start of the war, the message from Washington sounded simple. Hit Iran's military capabilities, damage the nuclear program, and leave. Quick operation, clean objective. But just a few days later, the explanation kept changing. From a limited strike, to prevent an imminent threat, to talks about regime change, and eventually, demand for unconditional surrender. So the real question is, was there ever a clear strategy behind this war? When the United States first launched its strikes against Iran, the mission looked limited and precise. Officials described the operation as a focused military campaign. The goals were straightforward. Destroy Iran's missile production capacity, damage its nuclear weapons program, and neutralize its naval forces. Once those objectives were achieved, the plan was to step away from the conflict. At least, that was the message. At the same time, another message was directed toward the Iranian public. If Iran's military power was weakened, the future of the country, politically, would be decided by its own people. The assumption was simple. This war would be short, maybe just a few days. But as the days passed, something started to change. The explanation behind the war kept shifting. On the first day, the narrative was very clear. The United States was conducting a limited military operation, strike military targets, damage nuclear capabilities, then leave. No long war, no occupation, and importantly, no claim about overthrowing Iran's government. It was presented as a precise military action. But that clarity didn't last very long. Soon after the strikes began, a new justification appeared. The U.S. administration said Iran had been preparing to attack American interests. The strikes, they argued, were actually preemptive, a defensive move to stop an incoming threat. But soon reports started surfacing that intelligence agencies had no confirmed evidence of such an imminent attack. And that raised a question. If the threat wasn't confirmed, then why exactly had the war started? On the third day, the U.S. Defense Secretary stepped in to clarify the mission. The message was firm. This war was not about regime change. The objectives were still limited. Destroy missile infrastructure, cripple nuclear facilities, weaken Iran's military power. That was it. According to the official explanation, the United States had no intention of turning Iran into another Iraq or Syria. The operation was supposed to remain contained. But again, the narrative didn't stay stable for long. Soon another explanation emerged. The Secretary of State suggested the situation was connected to Israel. The argument was that Israel might have attacked Iran first. And if Iran retaliated against American bases in the region, the United States would inevitably be pulled into the conflict. So the strikes were presented as part of coordination with Israel. But shortly after that, the president returned to the earlier explanation. Iran, he said, had been planning an attack against the United States. So within a matter of hours, two different explanations were circulating, and that only made the overall strategy look increasingly unclear. By the fifth day, the tone shifted dramatically. Officials began talking about weakening and dismantling the Iranian regime itself. This was a major change. Just 2 days earlier, the administration had explicitly said the war was not about regime change. Now, the conversation was moving in exactly that direction. What began as a limited military operation was starting to look like a much larger political objective. As the conflict intensified, attention turned toward Iran's internal leadership. After the death of Iran's supreme leader, the question of succession became urgent. Several potential leaders were mentioned, but many were reportedly hesitant. Taking the role meant becoming the next major target. At the same time, statements from Washington suggested that the United States might even influence who should lead Iran next. That idea signaled something important. The conflict was no longer just about military targets. It was now touching Iran's internal political structure. By the seventh day, the rhetoric escalated even further. The United States began demanding unconditional surrender from Iran. That meant the current regime stepping down, a new government being established, and the country eventually rebuilt afterward. At this point, the war had clearly moved far beyond the original objectives announced at the beginning. The narrative had changed completely. Looking at the timeline, a pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The justification for the war kept evolving. First, it was a limited strike. Then it was about stopping an imminent threat. Then coordination with allies. Then regime change. And finally, unconditional surrender. Each explanation pointed in a slightly different direction. And that raises a serious strategic question. Was there ever a consistent plan behind the war? Or did the objectives evolve only after the conflict had already begun? Possible future scenarios. If Iran refuses to surrender, and so far it has, the conflict could move in several directions. One possibility is a prolonged confrontation, a war of attrition where neither side achieves a quick victory. Another scenario is a broader regional escalation, more countries becoming involved, intentionally or unintentionally. And there is also the possibility that the conflict settles into a long period of instability rather than a decisive outcome. History has shown many examples of wars that began with limited goals and slowly grew far beyond their original intentions. The most striking part of this conflict isn't just the fighting. It's the changing story behind it. Within just a week, the narrative shifted repeatedly, from limited strikes, to defensive action, to regime change, to unconditional surrender. Each step moved the war further away from its original explanation. And that leaves one final question hanging over the entire conflict. If the objective keeps changing, how does the war actually end? Because once a war's purpose becomes unclear, its ending usually does too.